Welcome to the Red, White, News Show with Dean McMurray, the military medium.
All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another great episode of the Red, White, and News Show with the military medium. Today, friends, I have with me Benjamin Allen. Benjamin is an author. He is a grief expert in grief, and he's here today to talk to us about that. Benjamin, welcome to the Red, White News Show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Absolutely. So for those that are not familiar with your work, can you kind of bring us up to speed, as it were? Who is Benjamin Allen?
Well, it's related. Work and personal are so interrelated, is that who I am at the moment is a person that deals with people and companies on how to deal with loss. And so I part of my journey has been to have experienced great loss. I've worked in the field of the great loss with mainly death. And what I've done is come to a place to where I do individual counseling, but I do speaking, but I also do helping corporations learn how to better approach those that are dealing with loss, and also, ironically, with their own loss. So the journey started a long time ago with my wife and two children. First wife and two children died over a 13-year period, and she was given a transfusion in 1982 with HIV at the birth of our first child. We didn't know it, and we had another child 2.5 years later. And then both of our children ended up in intensive care. There was a lot of difficulties. She almost died. And then after the second child was born, we got a call from the blood bank where Lydia, my wife, we gave birth to our first child. And it was a look-back program on HIV, and she got a transfusion from someone during the birth. And they asked us all to be tested, and all three of them were HIV positive, and I was negative. And so the journey started with that, of going through the death of our first child was our youngest. And Bryan was 8.5 months old when he died. And then Lydia died about 3.5 years later. And then Matt, our oldest child, died at the age of 13. He wanted to live to be a teenager, and he lived a month after his 13th birthday, and he died. And so that 13-year period, in the midst of that, I also worked with people in hospice. I worked with those that were terminal. I worked in the field with the medical school and so forth, and dealing with people with great loss.
Wow.
What happened to me? Yeah, I can go on. What happened to me right after that was, after Matt died, was I went off from, this was in Dallas, Texas, and I moved to Mendocino, California, and I had nothing left. I wasn't a father anymore. I quit my job at the medical school. I just had nothing. And the journey really started with exploring where loss takes you there. It was always part of the continuum of our journey together. But with nothing left, all I had left was the grief. And I decided that I was going to follow that grief wherever it took me. I would lean into it and follow it. And we could talk about later some of the insights that came to me.
Sure. Well, I think it's such a heartbreaking story, but I find it unique that in the midst of that pain that you made a decision in that moment of having nothing, that so many people before you and even since have really saying, what do I have to live for? Right. What do you feel that made the difference for you of saying, I'm going to lean into this. I'm going to go where the grief takes me. Obviously, you probably
Well,
go ahead.
oh yeah. Where the reason I hung in there and leaned into it was because so much of my grief was stacked on top of each other. I never could fully grieve Bryan because I was taking care of Lydia and Matt. And so the grief just kept piling up. There would be expressions of it. There would be some diffusing of it, but the collection was enormous. I thought the hardest part was going through their deterioration and their death. The hardest part was after they had all died. And I sat there, and they had such incredible lives and incredible people. And they wanted to live so badly. And here I was with survivor's guilt. There's a lot, I'm sure, with your audience dealing with. We can explore that down the road. The survivor's guilt was enormous. But what happened to me was, in honor of their lives, I wanted to explore this and continue on. But I had this caveat that at the end of the exploration, I was going to take my life. I was just done. I was so done. And I lived on some savings at that time, very simply. And so I was just, when that ended, and I was done. And what happened was that in the evolution of it really leaning into this pain, I found a sense of this incredible compassion and love, and the transformation of what can I give to life.
Interesting that you bring up about by leaning into and embracing this grief, this emotion, and going through this process, knowing that in the forefront of your mind, that at the end of it, that you were just going to take your life. That was the plan. But somewhere in the process, you found a healing. You found something beautiful. It came out of all of this tragedy.
Yeah.
I think that is, I was looking up at the definition of grief prior to the interview, and really, talking about the process of, a normal, natural reaction to, and this is right off your website, obviously, to significant emotional loss of any kind. And I think a lot of times we associate that grief to somebody's death, right? So whether it's in combat, whether it's to disease, whether it's to, regardless, somebody passes, and then we grieve the loss. But it doesn't always have to be physical loss, does it? It doesn't have to.
Not at all. Not at all. And this is really important, that I prefer the term living in loss rather than grief, because we're living in loss. We're living in change. Loss, death, any kind of loss is really about how we respond and live in change. And so we're always changing. We're always dealing with loss. We talk about, and this is really important when I work with people and when I share with people, is one loss brings up all losses. And one of the illustrations I use is some of the people that I've connected with grew up in military families. And so they were moving every couple of years. If they were lucky, couple of years, they were moving.
Right.
That's loss. That's a loss of home, restarting again, a change. And that kind of loss collects in our system. And there could be a loss of a pet. There's loss with kids growing up and going off to college, the empty nest. There's loss there. That's not necessarily negative, but it's a change. But one loss brings up all losses. And what's really important is not the loss itself. That's important. But what's more important than that is how we deal with loss in and of itself, how we deal with change in and of itself. And our belief system everything is so tied in to how we deal with change. But great grief, great loss has an impact, but it has a collective impact. And that's one of the things that I discovered. And after they had all died, the collective nature of loss is that nothing lives in isolation. And so what people don't realize, someone may lose a pet and they're absolutely devastated. I'd be devastated in of itself just losing that.
Right.
But it brings up all their other losses. And they don't realize the magnitude living in that uncertainty, also that preparatory loss we can talk about later if you want, but
sure.
But it's really important to see the loss is really more about how we deal with change, how we deal with pain, how we deal with so many things. So I don't like the word grief because we've got I think, a horrible understanding of grief in our society. It's like there's a shelf life for grief. You get this much time to grieve, then you go back into your old life. There's no going back into the old life.
Right.
There's no going back.
Right. I love how you wrap that aspect up and that was going to be one of my questions because, there are a lot of folks put a shelf life, as you say, to grief, saying, oh, you've been, it's been, 6, 10, whatever, put a number to it saying, don't you feel it's time to move on? And everybody giving their expectations unto the other person that's going through this transition. And I love the phrase living in loss because there's an aspect of us that we've lost. There's that emotional connection, that physical, right, that we've lost. And I love that that phrase because I think that summarizes it so much more accurately versus the grief piece, right? Then you can use it on so many other platforms too, whether you lost your job, like you brought up, like moving in the military so often, whether, not just loss of life. Right?
Absolutely. Divorce, everything. Everything is a part of the ebb and flow of gain and loss. But when we're talking about moving on, that is a horrible thing to put on somebody. What I prefer to put it as, the paradigm I use, is moving into something greater. And it's a weaving of loss, love, and life. That's the tapestry in which we weave. And it's not about going back. There is no going back. In fact, one of the reasons, and some of the things I've written, is talk about I kind of coined the phrase called the afterloss. And that I was thinking, this was in my journey after they had all died, that there's no going back. There's no way how can I ever think of getting back to normal? There's normal's gone. And so I was thinking, when they died, part of my belief system is there's life beyond this. So there's an afterlife. Well, where am I? And I thought, well, I'm living in the afterloss. And what I started looking, and when I was walking along the cliffs, and then, is there's the surface world is going on. And when there's great loss that happens, whether it be a divorce or anything, there's this afterloss. There's this subterranean world that people are catapulted or drawn into. And it's a whole different landscape. And anybody that's dealt with great loss knows that we're out of sync with the world around us. Initially, the world's like this. It's a surreal world that's underneath that people enter into. And that landscape of the afterloss, part of my goal when working with people and helping people understand what's going on, is finding a way to weave the afterloss and the surface world back together into a harmony. And it's not one or the other. Moving into life and continuing life, we continue with the loss. It'll always be a part of my life. I will always have that as part of the tapestry of my life. and it's not like pushing it away. And we talk about the shelf life. This is what really concerns me for people that have this old idea of grief, is we have this service world and people are going along, the funeral happens, everybody gathers, they go back to their lives, and the person in great loss is left in this out of sync world. And what happens is the expectation to come back up is impossible. It's an impossible feat. And so people go into this secret sorrow. They just don't share it anymore. They don't express anymore. And so there's not a connection. And so that's really damaging to folks that they can't express. My son died 38 years ago, 40 years ago, whatever. And I don't grieve a 13-year-old that died. I grieve a 40-year-old I can't pick up the phone and talk to. I grieve not having grandchildren. I grieve that time, the continuum of time proceeds, and I'm grieving now the loss of my son, of who he would be now, the loss of my wife, who she would be now, and my other son, what he would be doing. So that never goes away. And some days, it just hits me like still a ton of bricks, especially around anniversaries. And we can talk about it on the road, how those impact. And there's a part that I feel guilty because I should be over it. And I said, that's bullshit. That's not true. And I'm just okay with it. But it still comes up. It's not, what I find is that when I touch those places with my love and that loss that continues on, that's where I find the expanse of my compassion, of my love, of my understanding of life. So that's the weaving of loss, love, and life, is when we touch those places, we lean into them, and that's what can come from them.
I love that. The afterloss, I think that summarizes that how do you want to say that, the no man's land, the area in between, right? It's
yeah, good way
certainly
to put it.
a interesting paradox that people all too often find themselves in. Let me ask you, Benjamin, so going back in time a little bit, and after you had lost everyone, and you found yourself in this space of afterloss, and here you were, you had this plan, you said about leaning into grief. At the end of it, you were going to take your life. How did you find in it? Obviously, in between, the place of finding beauty, and in the beginning, like how did you find your way? What was some of the things that that helped you in this after loss, and what were some of your experiences?
Well, honoring it. That's the first thing. It's not trying to push it away, but honoring this is my day. I used to say I'd have to pull myself out of bed and push myself out the door. That I just, and what I did was took life as simply as I could, and under the circumstances. And there's a whole lot of techniques around that. In grief, when I work with people, it's what replenishes and what diminishes, and the energy level. And I'd love to down the road, by the way, in this conversation, talk about preparatory grief, because, and especially with the folks that you are working with that are living in that constant apprehension of, is my loved one going to be okay? Or am I going to be okay? If something happens to me, are they going to be okay? Those kind of dynamics are really important to address down the road. But at this point, to answer your question, it was about taking life in inches and centimeters and seconds. It's about getting really simple and honoring the fact that this was what I could do. In the preparatory grief, and I utilize this afterwards, I use a term that the paradigm that helped me was the economy of energy. as I had to economize. It was kind of triage a day. How much could I get done? What could I do, especially when they were alive? It's like, I can do this much, but I still had to go to work. I had to do all this stuff, take care of them, all the things and everything. And I had to economize. And what I found was a scaling system that was really helpful for me. If somebody's in great loss, you think you can do this, but you really can't. 10 is like before all it hit. And you have to rescale. Of a 10 now is much less. Lydia and I had this kind of coded conversation system. I would come home from work and say, "How you doing today?" And we had a scaling system of 1 to 10. So I could know what I needed to do, what she was able to do, and 10 was doing a certain amount, and then a 1 and was being decimated. And she said to me one time, closer to her death, she said, "I've had to change that scaling system. The 10 used to be being able to get up and go to the store. Now a 10 is being able to get up and go to the refrigerator." And so we have to scale to our circumstances. And that's a lot of people that feel, "I'm not doing enough." They feel guilty. Why am I not getting back into the swing of things? And there really needs to be being gentle with ourselves, and a scaling system where that's been that triage and that day-to-day, what can I do today? And sometimes in the ebb and flow, a good day is being able to get out. A more difficult day, I never call them bad days, I just call them more challenging, is a more challenging day is when I can sit on the porch.
Right. Talking about, your journey through your grief, and, as you call it, the afterloss, and how you were navigating, the moments of time. Did you just, kind of stumble upon, dealing with, folks with, grief, or how did you get into counseling and everything else? Was that a normal, because I know that you were saying that, you had worked, with some folks with the Southwestern Medical School, but, was that just a natural progression that you started working with folks, or?
Well, I initially started out as a minister, and I was, that's kind of a story in and of itself. But I got out of that into working with people in interfaith around their spiritual journey and how to connect people with HIV into their religious communities of their choice, and then evolved into, many people didn't, so I just go in their homes and help them go through the process, and working with caregivers. My wife was a nurse, and she started a house for children with AIDS in Dallas, and they named it actually after Bryan, our youngest. It wasn't meant to be, but and she was also working at the Children's Hospital, and I was working at Parkland and with the medical school with patients, the community, and governmental agencies as well. So I kind of evolved into that, and I wasn't planning on doing more grief work, but that's just been been drawn to that. I've done other things as well, but it always comes back to what I can give, and this is where it's opened up to being able to give in this arena.
I was going to ask you too, Benjamin. I did see in your bio that you're a Baptist minister, or practicing, I should still say. Are you still a minister?
No
longer.
No.
So when you made the transition to, going through the afterloss and everything else, did it make you question, at any point, this is interesting for me because, you know, a lot of people that are very devout in their faith, regardless of what it is, sometimes comes up, you know, if there's a just God, you know, the question comes up saying, you know, why would God let my son, my daughter, my wife, my husband, whomever die? You know, there's that anger, there's those different phases of grief, but are going through the emotions of loss. But did that ever come up? Was that ever anything that
popped up every now and then? Yeah, it did cross my mind, dude.
One or two times, and
one or two times it popped up.
Right.
Yeah, that's part of the journey, and I'll come back to more specific to answer your question. But in a general term, when people go through great loss, it's like everything's up for grabs. Everything is like torn to pieces. One of the images I had when we first found out, I told Lydia, it was like there's been an earthquake and my house is just decimated, and I'm walking through the ruins of my house, picking up relics, saying, this I can use. This no longer serves me. This has been destroyed. And everything is restructured because it's up for questioning, and it's up for the emotional upheaval. And that's the one thing I would encourage people not to preempt the emotional upheaval, not to try to not be angry or to rationalize or hold it in. And what I find, and this is very important with leaning in, is that the kind of paradigm I use, that every emotion we have is like a river, and you got to keep it fluid. And so nothing is out of bounds, nothing is off limits, nothing is negative if it's in fluidity. And everything fluid goes to the ocean. And that ocean is the ocean of healing. And my definition of healing is not the absence of pain. Healing is finding peace within the pain. Because it's always going to hurt. I'm always going to miss it. That transforms, that changes, but the healing is finding peace within that. So, but every emotion in its fluidity, for me, has always led me to a place of healing, of compassion, of care. Now, my own journey with that has a tremendous amount of anger. When we first found out, even though we knew where the transfusion came from, we knew how she was infected, I wasn't infected, the church fired me. And so in that sense, that was like, really? Really? And we tried to find other churches that would accept Matt, because one of our real sticklers for us from the very beginning, there were two things that we decided. One, after that, we got the call from that initial conversation. We said, we're going to live quality, not quantity. Mm-hmm. We're going to live quality lives. The second thing was that we would never let Matt, he was 2 at the time, and Bryan was 8 at that time, but after the call was 5.5 months old, but that we would not leave them with anybody that didn't use the universal precautions. And back then in the early 80s or mid 80s, that nobody did. So ethically, we could not leave our child with someone that did not know. That put us in a hell of a dilemma, and so going to churches and so forth, there was a dynamic. Churches refused us and all that kind of stuff, all that. But the shifting for me came with working with people with HIV that were outside of the church experience, that were being rejected by the church. And the exclusivity of the church broke my heart, and it broke it open, and it expanded my heart, but it shifted me. So there was a lot of different elements of walking through this, right, and finding my own authentic belief system.
Because we got to remember now, back, you're talking about a time in the early 80s when the whole AIDS pandemic, there was really not a tremendous amount known about it. There was a lot of untruths, correct? There was a lot of misinformation that I remember even being a young kid in school, that the thought was, even if you held somebody's hand or sat where, a lot of misconceptions, right? And there was a lot. So it was I think a scary time for a lot of people. But but sad that that happened for your whole family at that time.
We had to live,
right?
We had to hide and live in secret, and they were burning children's houses down. That a family, it's pierced into my memory. In Florida, 3 hemophiliac children, their house was burned down. They wanted them out of the neighborhood. This was right when we found out there were kids being rejected from school. The social climate was absolutely horrendous, and we had to navigate ethically. How do we not put anyone in harm's way, and how do we give our child a normal life? Right. At the same time. And Lydia said one time back then, says, someday the world will catch up to the facts. Mm. But you know what? The interesting thing is watching the COVID and the relationship and the mentality in COVID with the HIV. I'm living through two pandemics, kind of thing.
Isn't that? And it's something, and it's interesting that, there's a lot of it that, of course I was younger at the time, but that I don't remember hearing about. But of course, back then we didn't have social media either, right? We didn't have some of the platforms that we did. But I want to go back to, here you are. This is just a tumultuous time in the world because of because of AIDS. Here, your family has the disease, and everything's crazy around you. And how do you, navigate that, like you said, ethically, morally, all that great stuff. And to not only that, but now you're finding that, basically where you were fired from your church. You guys basically were shunned, like you're not welcome here anymore. But then after they passed, and, did you feel that, that so many people up and, shunned you and your family because of, and did that add to the loss that you were going through, as far as, here you go, you had to deal with first I guess we would call it the loss of knowing they have a deadly disease, then going through the loss of being separated from your church, and then the loss of them physically at various times, right? And dealing with that.
Tons of loss. And so the question, let me see if I got it clear. What was your question again?
Well, I guess I was just reiterating that kind of things in your timeline as far as culminating. But did that, I guess, I don't really want to call it shunning, but did that
have an impact?
Yeah. Did that,
okay.
Yeah.
Yes, a great impact. And it was very hurtful and I went through a lot of anger and a lot of things. The shunning of the church was extremely painful. But also the people that showed up from that belief system, that faith system that embraced us, just made it shine even brighter.
Sure.
So there's the negative and the plus.
Sure.
On the larger scale of the shunning and all that,
right,
was incredibly painful, but was incredibly healing with individuals that really lived their faith and were so compassionate and so caring towards us. That's what carried us through, was the kindness. And when you're in a very cruel situation, kindness shines so bright. And so so I don't carry anything at this point. I did, and I had to go through that pain and anger and forgiveness. I read something back then. It was back then. A great line says, "Forgiveness is the price we have to pay for freedom." Mm. And at that time, it was so difficult to forgive. But in the evolution of my journey, that has come. And it's come in increments. And so I don't want to carry that kind of toxicity. I don't want to carry that kind of hurt, because all hurt is ultimately self-hurt. So yeah, it had a great impact, but so did the beauty.
In that journey, you started working with grieving individuals and groups, and you had been doing so, but how did you actually start with the Grief Recovery Institute, and then the evolutions of your books?
Well, the Grief Recovery Institute, I did courses there and some there, but they have a particular system that I wanted to honor, and they want you to honor. And so I've moved away from that. But anybody that wants to deal with grief and learn how to do that, it's an excellent program. It's more rigid than my approach, but they're excellent. So the Grief is down in LA, but it was through a friend that said, "Hey, you might want to do it." I was already doing it. I said, "Well, okay, I'll check it out," and I did it. But I wanted to honor that, so ethically, I don't want to identify with it, because they have a certain system that they want you to adhere to. A great system, but mine's a little more free flowing in the direction I've gone. So, but how I ended up is that I decided that it's part of my journey, and I could help people. Individuals were coming to me, and so I started into training people, how companies and so forth. One of the things that I do now is work with wealth managers and help them understand what people are going through. And so their clients, how they can be more compassionate, how can they meet their needs and so forth. And that as well as individuals. But at this point, and then speaking, I did not plan on writing my first book. That was not in my intention, and it just felt compelled. But it was after my healing had happened. It wasn't to create my healing. And so then there's other things that I've written that, like a workbook, that help people go through the process of grief. And basically, let me just say something, not about the book, but about my approach, is that I believe that going through great loss is a reintegration process. And if people could take it from that point of view, that you are reintegrating into a new person. And what I've done is put in basically three categories: the reintegration of myself, the reintegration with my relationship to the one that was lost, or the loss itself. It could be a divorce, it could be anything. And the reintegration to the world around me. I am not the same person. This is not the same relationship with this loss. This is not my same relationship with the world around me. So how do I reintegrate? And that's that whole thing of the after-loss world, the after-loss, reintegrating with the world here and with loss, love, and life. How do I continue to expand? So that's what I started doing, is working with people and helping people understand that.
Beautiful. Now, one of your latest works, and as I navigate around your website here, is Out of the Ashes, correct? Healing in the Afterloss, is that correct?
That Out of the Ashes and Healing that is the first thing. It's my own personal journey.
Okay.
That I went through. The Healing in the Afterloss, the workbook, is a companion, but the I wish I forgot to have it, but
That's all right.
that can be separate, but that's the one that takes those three categories of reintegration, and I break it down into the physical reintegration, the emotional, the mental, and the spiritual reintegration into the new me,
Right.
the new relationship with it's journaling and exercises and so forth. But the one that might be that would help your folks the most that are going through great loss is the last one. It's called Seasons of Solace, and that's the last one I've done, and that is quotes from my blog. My wife has put together. She would take out segments because I don't do little 50 quotes, but in the blog, she'll take out a couple of sentences and that are meaningful to her and the others. And then she put them on photographs, and I put them into seasons: autumn, winter, spring, summer, and of loss. And what you can do with that is pick it up anywhere and open it. And what we found was that people that are going through great loss can't read. They can't. If they can think about, turning off the coffee pot, they won that day. Right. So they can't read and concentrate. But this is something that is very gentle and very healing. And one of the most important parts about it is for people to understand you're not alone. That's one of the greatest difficulties and challenges and loss is that separation. And in that separation, the cascading into the avalanche of I'm alone. I don't, no one can understand this. And when I work with people, especially wealth managers, say, don't ever say, I know how you feel. You will never know how someone feels. And what I say to people is, I have no idea how you feel. I have no idea what you're going through, but I'm here for you. Because that's the most truest statement. I am here for you. And that's what that book is about. You're not alone. But it's not about, I also, one of the things that I say is those that have not gone through great loss don't know what to say. And those that have gone through great loss know there's nothing that can be said. Right. It's about presence. It's about being there for each other.
Right. Kind of holding space per se for somebody. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Let me ask you, Benjamin, if somebody today is listening to this podcast, whether they're veterans or it doesn't matter, they could be from any walk of life. It doesn't matter what they do or whatever, but they're experiencing loss. They're in some form of grief over something for someone. What is maybe a couple steps, maybe a couple things that, if they're looking for something, what could be something that might be able to help them get started on their journey?
Some of the most important things in preparatory grief, if you're dealing with someone that you're losing, or if you're a caregiver or so forth, that could be a whole nother subject, but it's leave nothing unsaid, leave nothing unfinished. Unfinished business is much more difficult in the aftermath. Now, after loss. So it does not negate what someone has to do after loss. I had a lot of preparatory grief and a lot of experience, but each one after the loss had its own set of dynamics. But the one thing that didn't have to take place is the unfinished business. So if you're in that, in either preparatory or post-grief, find community, find support, find people that you can trust and can be there. The thing about grief that's really interesting, and everyone I've worked with, this is a part of this, is that the people you think are going to show up, sometimes they don't. And the people you think you're surprised that they're there. But find the community that are there, that are present. That's so important, because in the isolation, that's where there's no outlet. There needs to be outlets. For me, I paced myself, and I had outlets. I had support of people that I felt safe with, exercise, things that I could release some of this. But everything, you need to have an outlet. When you lean into something, it has to go somewhere. There's the laws of physics. So.
Right. Beautifully said. I love that aspect. Benjamin, where can they go if they want to find out more about you, your speaking, your books? Where can they go?
Well, they can go. There's a Facebook page that my wife put together. I'm not on Facebook. I don't do any social media. It's not my thing. But it's called Grief and Healing in the Afterloss. And there's quite a few people on there. And Rachel actually put that together. There's some of my writings. We bring in other writings. We have people. It's a place for people to not feel alone. That's on Facebook. There's a website, theafterloss.com. It has some of my writings on there, and can be contacted through that.
Beautiful. Well, my friends, Benjamin, thank you so much for being on the Red, White, and You show. It's been not only enlightening, but, I just thank you for sharing not only your story, but the words of encouragement and inspiring others that are going through, as you call it, those living in their own afterloss and trying to negotiate that, or in that preparatory phase, right? And trying to negotiate those challenging times as well.
Thank you, Dean. I really appreciate you having me on and giving an opportunity to connect with people that may be experiencing this journey and being a part of the journey and a part of yours. So thank you.
Absolutely.